What I wanted to do is I wanted to change gears a little bit and talk with you a little bit about what I've learned to be, what I look for as indicator plants. Okay, what is it in our turfs in terms of, now in this case, we're only going to talk about weeds today, but diseases can be an indicator of a particular turf problems. Certain insects can indicate, historically, if you have a certain problem with a certain insect, it may be an indicator that you've got some soil problems and so on and so forth. But in this case, let's focus a little bit of attention on turfgrass weeds, and then work through this with me and see if you haven't noticed the same situation in those landscapes that you're managing or those turfs that you're involved with. First and foremost, turf grasses grow best in full sun and in well-drained soils. And I told Rodney Lingle yesterday, we were out on at Memphis Country Club. Gosh, I love your soils out here in West Tennessee. I wish all of you could see the soil that we have in Norris, where I live. And we've got great soils. They're basically a silt loam soil lot. But the problem is it's only about 1.5 inches deep, and then I start to experience limestone rock. And so I tell my wife, we've got great soils, but just not enough of them. And I've been guilty of actually thinking about leasing a jackhammer just to plant some plant materials in our landscape. So I'm envious of many of you that are managing turfs in great soils. But that's one of the keys. Let's plant these turf grasses where they grow best. Now we're going to talk a little bit about signs and symptoms this morning. But how many of you, after reading these 4 signs, would be confused? Do I park on the grass? Don't I park on the grass? Do I walk on the grass? Don't I walk on the grass? Well, I got to thinking about this, and Bob, one of those is your sign. And I love that sign. What does that sign say, that one on the lower left? Please do not walk in the road for safety's sake. Please walk on the grass. Now that's an invitation. That's the mindset that we're of here in West Tennessee. If you're not going to be able to walk on the grass, what good is it? Okay? But, and what about this little sign up here on the right, upper right, that's taken at a little place called Harbor Village out in northeast Oklahoma. Let's park a bus on the grass, okay? But then, on that same site where I took that picture of that big sign up here, I took that picture to the left. Now wait a minute, I can park the bus on the grass, but now I got to keep off the grass. So it got me thinking, okay, I've never really given a presentation that deals with indicators or signs. So bear with me. But again, as we manage these turfs, let's think a little bit about turfgrass soils. And let's think about the soils in general in Tennessee. Look how many different soil series there are in this state. And those of you, how many of you manage properties where you've got one property adjacent to another property, but you know the soils are totally different? They've been moved, they've been shaped. Maybe it's taken 2 or 3 years before the soil structure actually returns to that site. Maybe it takes a little while for the turfgrass root system to develop to help that movement of water and air and channel that movement of water and air through a soil that's been mixed. So, but I always like to mention that, think about when you're dealing with turfgrass diagnostics to try to figure out why a turf isn't performing well. Think about soils, think about light, and think about cloud cover. And always try to remember, and this is something that I tend to forget, it takes a while for a turf grass under stress to display that stress. Okay? The stress may occur 2 or 3 days earlier, but you may, the first time you view that stress, you may think that stress is due to something that occurred that morning. And the reality is that might have occurred 3 days ago, 5 days ago, and it took that long for that turf grass to respond to that stress. Okay? But think about partly cloudy days. We don't give it much thought, but just think about how much photosynthetically active light is being absorbed by that cloud cover that could be reaching the turf surface that could be beneficial for that turf to produce sugars such that it can survive and reproduce. The other thing I'd like you to think about, and I try to think about this a lot, is the influence of relative humidity on turf grass performance. I've It's been a long time since I've been as cold as I was yesterday. Now, how cold was it at about 2 a.m. in Memphis yesterday? How cold was it here? How cold was it? Was it in the 40s? Okay, now years ago, when I was in my 20s, the 40s was, you know, piece of cake. 40s, that's shirt sleeve weather. But it's no longer that way for me. And what I found is, when it's humid, when it's moist and cold, or moist and 40, it's cold. It's darn cold. And so I want you to think about humidity and its impact on turf grasses. So this is kind of a busy slide, but bear with me here. What we're looking at here across the x-axis is wind speed. Okay, so we're going, this set of blocks here represents 0 miles per hour. This middle set represents 10 miles per hour, and of course, out here is 20 miles per hour. Okay, and then going up the y-axis here, that represents evaporation rate. That is an estimate of the amount of water that's evaporated from the turf surface in inches per hour. In inches per day. Okay, inches per day, miles per hour. Then, these individual colored columns represent differences in relative humidity. Okay, so yellow, the light yellow represents 0 humidity. And I believe the dark green here represents what, 75%? So, oh, 30, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, 75%. It's a little moist. Kind of like a sauna. So that would be 30. Okay, but look, so my question is, what is consistent across this slide? Even though the wind speed is increasing, what is consistent whether we're in this block or this block? Okay, the amount of water evaporated in inches per day is influenced by relative humidity. The higher the relative humidity, the less transpirational water movement through the turf. Okay, so turf grasses, from a standpoint of water conservation, relative humidity can be a good thing. But from the standpoint of that turf grass being able to transpire water to maintain the proper internal tissue temperature, that's a disadvantage. Turf grasses generally don't like relative humidity. Okay, now think about how many times in your career where you've walked from one area of the landscape to the other, and you've almost felt a change in relative humidity. So there'll be areas in your landscapes where some turf grasses are doing very well. They're able to maintain transpiration rates. When the water's moving through the plant, what's happening to the mineral nutrient in the soil near the roots? See, it's moving into the plant enough, right? But a plant that's not transpiring water, can it move minerals? Can it move its essential minerals from the soil up to the leaf tips? No. So you can begin to see why high relative humidity tends to stress our turf grasses. They become less fertile, they're moving less water, the tissue temperature increases, and things sometimes just build on each other in terms of factors until that turf just dies. Okay? Well, let's think about weeds as indicators of problems in the landscape. I'll have you know, I could have gone to, I think I'm only going to show you one slide of my lawn today, but this could represent my lawn. I'm kind of like the painter's home in the neighborhood. But I took this right outside the door at Ellington, at the Ellington Plant Sciences building where I work. But think about certain weeds and see if this doesn't make sense. First of all, let's remember that sometimes the most difficult identification to make is when the weed is in its infancy. Okay, when it's an infant, when it's a very young plant. Weeds can be categorized based on whether they have 2 seedling leaves or 1 seedling leaf. Okay, if the plant has 2 seedling leaves, chances are it's going to be a broadleaf weed. Okay, it might be clover, dandelion, ground ivy. So at least, if you can't identify, how many of you can identify that weed? I can't identify that weed yet. But I can tell you one thing, it's not going to be a grass. See, so the fact that you know that the seedling leaves are either going to be in numbers of 2 or 1, you at least know what category of weed it might be. where the grasses just come out of the ground with one seedling leaf, one cotyledon. So the grasses are called monocots, and the broadleaf weeds are called dicots. And that just refers to the number of seedling leaves that you'll find generated by that seedling. Now there are some outliers, okay? Sedges and colingas. How many of you have seen these weeds multiply over time here in West Tennessee in some of your landscapes? I think I'm seeing more of them. I think part of that may be because of the amount of rainfall we've been getting. Basically the sedges have triangular stems. They're grass-like in nature, but they have very, very strong storage organs below the ground. We call them tubers usually. And they normally don't have the color, the good color of a turf grass. But they're very easily identified just by looking at the structure of the stem. And then, how many of you have seen the rushes? How many of you like to hike? Okay, how many of you have hiked in the forest or in the woods? You'll tend to see a lot of these species in the forest, particularly in areas where you'll see a break in the canopy and there'll be some light reaching the surface. Then you'll see that area populated by this. But the rushes are basically, they're cylindrical in stem shape, but they're hollow. Okay, so if you want to determine whether you're dealing with a rush or a sedge, just remember the sedges have triangular stems, and the rushes, they have an oval kind of a stem, but if you cut across it, it looks like a miniature straw. Okay, so how do you get your information when you find a weed that you can't identify or have not seen? How do you go about finding out more about it? See, many of us, I go to my friends. I'll go to Dr. Neil Rhodes, or like in one time I was out here at Summer Celebration, and I said, man, I don't know what this weed is, but I've got a good friend who will, and Bob Hayes. And see, I do okay identifying turfgrass weeds, but when it comes to agronomic weeds, I'm not your guy. That's the other thing you'll notice is those of you that are managing sites that were formerly farms, and then maybe in year 1 and 2 you start to see weeds that you can't identify, chances are that might not even be a turfgrass weed. That might be giant horseweed or giant ragweed. You know, as you continue to manage your turfs, you'll find that the population of weeds changes. They become turf-type weeds. What must a turf weed be able to tolerate? Yeah. So see, now Johnson grass can be a problem in a lawn. But isn't it amazing that you've got a plant that is robust to the point that it might be 6 or 7 feet in height along the roadside, yet there's something about that plant over time that will allow it to adapt to a height of cut of 2 inches. We don't see a lot of Johnson grass in our lawns, but we may see just enough to be problematic. Our clients will notice that that's a weed. Well, let's think about compacted soils. Okay, think about those turfs that you're managing, and you know the soils are compacted. What weeds might you expect to see? Before I show you my slides, give me some ideas. Crabgrass, great. Path brush, very, very, very much so. Anything else?
Dallas grass.
Dallas grass. I'll swear that stuff can grow on concrete. Yeah. Okay, well let's do this though. Let's set this up a little bit. I want you to now. This is information I think many of our clients in East Tennessee really appreciate, because those soils up in upper East Tennessee are so high in clay. But did you know a moist clay soil, it's very prone to compaction. A moist clay soil can compact as a tree root grows into it. Did you know that? Tree roots can actually compact with moist clay soil. So a soil under a tree can be very compact and we don't even think about it. Okay? And the other thing is, the rate at which water moves into the soil can be as slow as 1/10 of an inch an hour in a clay soil. Now, would that pass a perk test for septic? 1/10 of an inch an hour? I want to sell the tile for the leach bed on that one, because if that passes, just imagine how long that leach bed's got to be because of the lack of perk rate. No, well, we talk about infiltration, but basically the percolation through those soils is very restricted. So crabgrass definitely is an indicator of a compacted soil. Okay, so why on earth would crabgrass be able to tolerate compacted soils or be problematic in compacted soils? And why wouldn't turf grasses be able to do as well, just as well? What is it about crabgrasses that allows it to survive in that type of an environment? The seed has to receive sunlight in order to germinate. The seed, in order for the germination process to begin, it has to be able to take up water. Well, if we get a ½ inch rain on a compacted soil, how moist is the surface? See, it's fairly moist, right? It's going to stay moist for a while. And the turf is thinning. So if the turf thins, what happens to the light penetration within the canopy of grass? It becomes greater and greater. So sooner or later, crabgrass being opportunistic, it's going to show up as compacted soils. So when you think about it, crabgrass should be an indication of compacted soils. What about this one? You surely don't have goosegrass problems out here in West Tennessee. Well, see, it's going to germinate about 3 to 5 weeks later than crabgrass. But again, it's going to do well in compacted soils. It's a summer annual, just like crabgrass. Okay. What about this one? Why would this one be problematic in compacted soils? How many of you have dealt with this one over the last, say, 7 to 10 years? Virginia buttonweed. Did you know that plant can produce seed below ground? See, there are certain characteristics within these individual weed species that allows them to function well in areas where other plants don't. And so that's kind of what we're talking about here today. But Virginia buttonweed, persistent Virginia buttonweed, can indicate that your soils are quite compacted. How many of you manage sports fields? If you have not seen knotweed, there's something wrong. How many of you do notice that in the summertime, you can go particularly at the perimeter of the field where the traffic pattern is, where the utility vehicles and the maintenance vehicles moving in and out, you'll see knotweed in those areas. Okay? And then you may see purslane. That's a little more rubbery. I consider that almost a succulent plant. Very rubbery and kind of has a reddish purple stem. Very easy to identify. Okay, let's think about this one. What can be an indication of low nitrogen? What weed?
Clover.
Or what types of weeds? What type of clover?
White clover.
Okay, really, all the clovers have the capacity to capture nitrogen from the atmosphere. They're leguminous plants. Their roots are nodulated so that there's a very beneficial bacteria in that root that allows that, within that root system, that allows that plant to capture atmospheric nitrogen. Okay? Turf grasses can't do that, but the interesting thing is turf grasses require a lot of supplemental nitrogen. Okay, so if you're not fertilizing your turfs with enough nitrogen each year, you're going to see that the clover tends to do quite well. But even if you are fertilizing your turf grasses well, where else will clover show up? How many of you have noticed that clover is establishing in swales, where you've got moisture collecting or moisture standing water? But low nitrogen, of course, the leguminous plants are indicators of the need perhaps for additional nitrogen applications. Black medic, another example of a leguminous plant. What about hop clover? The little yellow flowered clover? What about common lespedeza? You guys surely wouldn't have lespedeza problems in your turfs. You know, but the nice thing is, this group of weeds can be controlled with strategic applications of the three-way herbicides. Dr. Braz is going to talk with you about that type of situation, what your options are. Okay, what about poorly drained soils? What species of weeds might you expect to see in poorly drained soils? What was it? Nut grass or nut sedge? Exactly right. So, how many of you have ever pulled a nut sedge plant up and you've just made it angry? You know, there's so much stored energy below ground I'll swear that you can, nutsedge can tolerate 10 days of submersion and survive that. Several grasses can't. Okay? So in poorly drained soils, nutsedge can be a problem. But, the rushes. I remember one year in Oklahoma, we were doing a lot of roadside research where the goal was to control Johnson grass and allow the Bermuda grass underneath to release so that our Department of Transportation folks in Oklahoma would not have to mow as much. The mowing cost per acre at that time was about $15.15 an acre, all things considered. Now that's going back into the early 80s, okay? But we could make a herbicide application for less than that. That would be, so the idea is if we can control the Johnson grass and allow Bermuda grass to release, now we've got a canopy of turf that is erosion resistant, but the motoring public looks out there and says, you know, that looks pretty good. It doesn't have that look as though it needs to be mowed. But in the process, what I noticed, along the shoulders of the road, you can almost always find the rushes. And sometimes, how many of you have traveled and you notice, you know, where they make the temporary road, you're on a 4-lane highway, and then all of a sudden you've got a bridge that they're working on, so they redirect you to the other side, and now you're meeting traffic, and then you cross where the bridge was, and then you cross back. Well, in many cases, after they walk away from that site, after the bridge is constructed, everything's going the way it should be, you're back with 4 lanes. If you go back and look at the weed species that invade those areas, that are basically void of vegetation, one of the first species that shows up are the rushes. Okay? They're very opportunistic. Rushes are very well adapted over a range of conditions. I could ask you about dry soils and I'd give you a picture of a rush. So rushes could show up in wet soils and dry soils. What about this one? Why would annual bluegrass be an indicator of poorly drained soils?
Hydrophilic.
What was that?
They're hydrophilic, they love water.
They love water. Okay, but think about, let me ask you this one then. How deeply rooted is annual bluegrass?
We'll say about 680 feet.
See, as a plant, it's fairly compact. We know that they can produce seed at an eighth of an inch height. It's a problem on well-manicured golf greens. Okay, but the root system is not all that deep. It's very fibrous, but it's not all that deep. So the fact that it's shallowly rooted and the fact that there's moisture available up in the top 1 inch, doesn't it make sense that something like that may be more competitive with a perennial turf grass than when a situation is the soils are well drained and the perennial turf grass is capable of producing above and below ground runners? So see, annual bluegrass sometimes can be an indicator of poorly drained soils. What about this one? Big time. When you start to see algae, you think about poorly drained areas, and sometimes mosses can also be problematic in those areas. What about common chickweed? How many of you have seen common chickweed around the foundation of a home, where the soils are just as compact, almost as concrete? You know, that soil around that foundation might have been compressed to about 95% compression. And so you'll sometimes see a lot of chickweed around the foundation of a home due to the poorly drained nature. Barnyard grass. How many of you have noticed maybe a little more barnyard grass than you've seen over the past, say, 5 years? I think I'm seeing a little more, or I don't know if I'm seeing a little more or just noticing it more. But barnyard grass can be an indicator of moist soils. Well, sometimes the best control is not a herbicide. Sometimes the best way to deal with a moist soil is make sure it's not moist. You know, so think about this. I took this slide. This came off the honors course. David Stone had some of the best Myrozoysia I'd seen in a long time. But, and this was back in the mid-90s, to late 90s. But the thing I like about the drainage systems today, we've got a lot of opportunities to select the drainage system we want to install. We might not have to use that 6-inch trencher anymore. This is a little 2-inch diameter perforated tubing. Okay, so he used a 3-inch trencher here to go and install that, so you're not removing as much soil. How many of you have ever installed the stack pipe drainage? Did it work? You would use it again? How many of you have ever used the drainage system that looks like an egg box or an egg crate, where you folded it, you've opened it, and you've installed it vertically, and then you've wrapped it with a geotextile? Sometimes you'll see that. So see, there are some very creative drainage systems available now where you don't have to work so hard and move so much soil. One of the most problematic areas in turfgrass care is trying to manage turfs and shade. Bob, I told Dr. Brosnan, I said, I want to go look at that TIF grant. Is it over by the headquarters, where the residential area was, the gray house? Okay. How many of you have looked into the Bermuda grass TIF grant that Jason Pooler's group sells? If you haven't, I want to encourage you to take a hard look at that grass. Find out what you can do with it. Find out what its shade tolerance is. Find out whether it'll do better in a moving shade than a persistent shade day long. But I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at the amount of shade it'll tolerate. It probably is not going to tolerate much over a 55% shade if the area is shaded all day long. But I think if that turf receives about 5.5, 6 hours of direct sunlight a day, I think you're going to find it'll hang in there. But how successful are we in West Tennessee managing creeping red fescue in the shade? See, it's too hot. You know, we might see a 30% population that will maintain for 12 months or more, but when you're dealing with creeping red fescue seeding and you establish it for the first year in a heavily shaded area, you're going to find that you're probably going to interseed that every year just to try to maintain the density. And it's got great shade tolerance, but it's got poor heat tolerance. And so the further south we go, as we start to encounter hot shade, it becomes very problematic. But here's some species that do like the shade. I tell our master gardeners across the state of Tennessee, you have to learn to embrace moss. You know, there are some areas, and you just, as a turf guy, it was hard for me to finally admit this, but there are areas in the landscape in which you cannot maintain turf, persistent turf. So I don't think we should consider that a compromise at all. Just try to grow your turfs in those areas that are best adapted. But again, mosses, the presence of moss can be an indication of shade. What about this one? How many of you have areas where the wild violet started in the shade, but unfortunately it moved out into full sun? So see, it's adapted in full sun, but it can be an indication of too much shade. Here's one that I look for. Bob, I don't know how much of this you see out here, but if I start to see heel all, I've seen quite a bit of it now. Morristown, Johnson City, Knoxville, Oak Ridge. I don't know how much you'll see out here in West Tennessee, but if you start to see this species, it's very tolerant of shade. What about this one? It'll do fairly well in shade, and in full sun it isolates out in patches. Nimble will. And the good news is Dr. Brosnan's going to tell you how you can control it. This is one that's becoming really problematic in commercial lumber production in the forests. There's actually some foresters that have looked at weed control specifically directed at this weed. This is called Japanese stiltgrass. It's all over Cades Cove up in the Smokies. And it almost has a lamb's quarter-like look in the fall. It'll get kind of a purplish coloration just before the first frost. And I've got an area that is actually just a collection area where I leave my organic debris collect. And it, over the summer, you just see this flush of growth, this particular species. And then as we approach winter, it'll become purple, and then eventually it'll die off. But it's very prolific seed producer, the Japanese stiltgrass. Okay, now, how many of you have noticed under pine trees certain weed species thriving? You know, those pines, they mine calcium. They love calcium. So what happens as the calcium moves out of the soil into the tree? What happens in terms of the soil pH, or the level of acidity of the soil? As you remove calcium from a soil, does the pH go up or down? Right. So you might see a totally different spectrum of weeds when you're managing properties where there's a row of pines or a grove of pine trees. So, one thing that I've noticed over the years, the color of a turf grass is not a very good indicator of a soil acidity problem. I've seen extremely deeply colored Bermuda grasses on soils that were highly acidic. The foliage looked great. You know, the plant density was terrible, but the individual plants were darkly colored. Now, so I want to just take a little bit of time. You guys have probably seen this slide hundreds of times, those of you that have been attending these workshops over the years. But look what happens. First of all, that soil pH range, normally from a pH of 4 to a pH of 10, okay? A pH of 7 represents neutral. Anything less than 7 is considered acidic. Anything over 7 is considered an alkaline soil. Well, the wider the green band here, the more available the nutrition is in that soil is available to the plant. But look what happens to the availability of manganese, for example, if the soil pH is high. It's in the soil, but see, it's precipitated. It's unavailable to the plant. Did you know you can create an iron deficiency by applying too much lime? Okay? But here's what I wanted to show you. Under acidic conditions, look at how the availability of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, those become very limited in terms of availability in the soil as our soils become more acidic. But there's something about these next species of weeds that I'm going to show you that allows them to thrive in this area. Now let me ask you this. How can a turf maintain its color? I've seen here in West Tennessee, the lowest pH I've seen on a soil tested was 4.1. I've talked to Debbie Joins about that over the years at the soil testing lab. I've talked to Frank Hale and Alan Linden. And the soil, well, that soil pH is down in the 4s. That's pretty doggone low. But how can that turf maintain dark green color? Look at the availability of nitrogen at that pH level of 4.2. Very low. But what is it down here that's maintaining that plant color? Right. So see, the iron is highly available. So you can't really use turf grass color as an indication of a soil acidity problem because there's so much iron. Okay? Now, let me ask you another question. What element can we use? How many of you are managing azaleas and rhododendron in the landscape, or maybe even some blueberries? What do you use to lower the pH? Okay, now you're using sulfur to lower the pH, right? Now, if you use sulfur to lower the pH, would you not think that sulfur would be very available to the plant? You know, you're applying sulfur to that area, so you wouldn't necessarily think that you're going to run into a sulfur deficiency. But look what happens. What happens to the availability of sulfur as the pH becomes acidic? Isn't that interesting? You can apply sulfur to a plant that is an acid-loving plant, but the reality is it may not be available for plant uptake. So you can have a sulfur issue in a plant in which you just applied sulfur to. So that, so I've studied this. So I've looked at this chart so many times. I'm thinking, no, wait a minute, that just doesn't make sense. We apply sulfur, but it's unavailable. But you'll actually see that. So just because you apply sulfur to lower the pH to make that plant, that acidic-loving plant, grow better, just think about those peripheral plants where the soils may be more acidic. You may not have available sulfur there, even though you're thinking, man, I just put sulfur out. So I just thought that's kind of interesting. So the best thing you can do when you're dealing with plant materials that like the slightly acidic soils is soil test. Now here's an indicator of an acidic soil. You may see this one under those pine trees. Okay, sheep soil has kind of an arrowhead-like leaf shape. But sheep soil, I've seen this one growing at a pH of about 4.2, 4.3, and thriving. What about this one? How many of you remember seeing a lot of ground ivy under those pines? See, there's a reason for that. For some reason, there's something about the physiology of that plant that allows it to perform well in shade. I'm sorry, in acidic soils. And cinquefoil, same thing. So these are some species that you might expect to see in an acidic soil. Okay, what about a basic soil? What about the flip side? Are there any weeds out there that will tolerate a soil high pH? And I could only find one in the literature, but that one. Now, if you pull that plant out, what am I going to see below ground? Is that a very shallow rooted plant? No. Now see, what I think is happening is that taproot is so deep, and as you move from the surface of the soil down into the soil, sometimes you'll see actually an increase in pH. But there's something about the physiology of that plant that allows it to thrive in a soil that's very high in pH. I've noticed this myself. When my first 3 years in Tennessee, I was dealing with, I was looking at bed grass greens. And I was looking at areas in which sand was being blasted onto the green surface from the sand traps. Okay? And nematodes love sand. Okay? And my coworker at UT, I asked Dr. Callahan when I came to Tennessee, I said, tell me about nematode problems in Tennessee. I'm familiar with where we have them in Oklahoma, but what am I looking at here in Tennessee? And he said, Tom, really, nematodes are not much of a problem because of our low winter temperatures. Okay, but I kept noticing that on certain greens, nematode populations were really high, and I kept seeing spurge in these areas where the sand trap was next to the green, and the golfers were blasting sand. And these greens were not high sand profile greens. They were just pushed up greens, native soils. But the areas where the sand had been basically top dressed by the golfers every year, and we had more of a sand base in the top, say, 1.5 inches, nematodes would populate that area. And I kept seeing one weed species in that area that was thriving, and it was spurge. Well, sure enough, spotted spurge is resistant to nematodes, certain nematodes. Okay? So if you see spotted spurge and you know you're in an area of the landscape that has soils high in sand, you might think about nematodes. I know at Bill Myers Stadium up in Knoxville, where the Blue Jays used to play, the Blue Jay farm team, downtown Knoxville, my good buddy Bobby Campbell, right behind home plate, he had an area where he just could not grow ryegrass. And he was overseeding ryegrass, every fall, so he'd have the first 4 weeks of the season, the field would look good because he had a Bermuda grass base. But he could not grow ryegrass there. And I said, Bob, let's do this. Let's just, for the heck of it, let's run a nematode sample. And see, as far north as Knoxville now, I don't mind telling you, back in the 80s, it got cold in Knoxville in the wintertime. But for some reason, those nematodes were highly adapted to that one zone and on that baseball field, and they were wiping that ryegrass out. And so sometimes nematodes can show up in your landscapes and cause problems just in certain zones, and it might frustrate you because the rest of your landscape, your turf looks great. You'll have one or two areas that are just thinning. And if you start to see spurge, maybe that's an indicator you might want to send a nematode sample to Mississippi State to let them run a nematode assay. But look at all the weeds that have been demonstrated to be tolerant of certain nematodes. I just noticed spurge, but things like dandelion, goosegrass, the summer annual weeds, green and yellow foxtail, spotted spurge, white clover, yellow foxtail, yellow nutsedge. These are weeds that have been shown to be very tolerant of nematodes. So, how many of you have ever run into a nematode problem in your management of turfs? Anybody in here? Just might be something to think about. If you've got some areas that are just not performing well. Well, my last couple of slides, I wanted to let you know that you've got a fantastic list of speakers beyond me. And I hope you have a great day. But Dr. Brosnan provided many of the turfgrass images we saw today. And I'm sure he's going to provide you his contact information for his website. And I hope you're going to be excited. He showed me last night he's working on a phone held application. It'll be something I hope you're excited about, but you're going to have access, internet access from your iPad, iPod, Droid, to product information, product label information, weed ID information, both in ornamentals and in turfs. And I think I'll let him talk more about that. But I thank you so much for listening to me, talk so long. But again, it's an honor to be here, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you very much.